Well, good morning, Trinity friends. We are so glad that you're here with us this morning in our third part of our series on the Baptismal Covenant, one Lord, one faith, one baptism. We're so thrilled today to have the Reverend Dena Whalen here with us today. Dena is the vicar of Church of the Advocate. She's been with the Church of the Advocate for about a year, I think.
Yeah.
And so we've heard her preach, we've heard her celebrate, and so I'm so excited to be with you in this format as well, Dena. Dena, thank you for taking the time today.
It's great to be here, David. Thanks for inviting me to do this, take part in this. Yeah.
Well, if you haven't watched previously, the first week, Scott and I talked about baptism in general. And then last week, the Reverend Deacon Tim Ervelina and I had a conversation about respecting the dignity of every human being and seeking justice and peace, which is one of those questions in the Baptismal Covenant. So if you haven't seen those, please, those are available on demand on our YouTube station. But today we're here to talk about another one of these covenant promises that we make in our baptismal service. And this is actually one that you chose, Dena. This is the question that you really wanted to talk about. And it's that first question of those 5 covenantal promises and pledges that we make. It's, will you continue in the apostles' teaching, fellowship, in the breaking of the bread, and in the prayers? And of course, we always answer, I will, with God's help. But I'm curious, what about this particular question drew you to it?
Well, we all say these vows several times a year, at least every time there's a baptism or the high feast days and whatnot. And as I've spent time with them, and I did spend a year with these, we had a small study group that was dedicated to discerning in a church where I was rector, what that particular church's role was in assisting our members and our neighbors as they either aged in place or had to make transitions as they aged more and more into elderhood. And we decided early on that these 5 questions would be our plumb line for how we studied and what we came up with. And of course, the first question about the apostles' teaching, breaking of bread, fellowship, prayers, that's like, to me, the marinade that those are the practices. It's like, I'm going to do this every week, every day or whatever. It's the practice, it's the habit that we commit ourselves to so that we are able to live into the next 4 questions.
There's no hope if we're not centered in this first one, right?
That's right. So the next 4 are a pretty high and holy call that many of us find ourselves falling short of, even though we try. And of course, being so planted in parish life through these ordained years, seeing the year in and year out of how people's lives are affected or aren't affected by these practices. And these, every monastic group has its rule of life, but this is the rule of life for every Christian that supersedes your and my ordination vows and other religious vows. But these are the cornerstone. And so, I've watched and observed, how is it effective when I am able to witness people really practicing these things in a disciplined and intentional way, whether it's raining or snowing or a sunny day or whatever, And so folks that week after week are dedicated to studying with a group of people or taking part in EFM, or folks that would share with me about their private devotional life and their private reading, and seeing how that just gave them such a firmer core I mean, almost like physical, we talk about, strengthening our core. Um, and, and then the fellowship certainly, and the prayers, breaking of bread, but all of that kind of takes place at least symbolically on a Sunday morning, and then it lives its way out through the week. Um, but when we really are engaged in this, and the people that I've seen that have been engaged in this throughout years of their lives, um, there really is, those are the ones that so often I just found that sure kind of bedrock solidity when times got tough. And those are the ones that I've realized when we did the burial office. The burial office is about those people. I mean, in its formal way. I mean, it includes everyone, but when the burial office is said for somebody who has intentionally given themselves to these disciplines, it's just amazing. It's amazing how personal those impersonal office words in the burial office become when they're describing somebody like this.
If you look at the kind of the prayers of the people that we say over the person who has died, those final kind of prayers, a lot of them mimic some of what we're hearing in these baptismal vows, about being washed in baptism, about being fed at the table, and things of that nature. So it's I love that you're connecting the idea of baptism and burial, because very much in our tradition, they
Full
are
swing.
together, right?
Yeah. And I
It
think
does, the liturgy and the fellowship and the apostles' teaching and the table fellowship, it really does kind of form a rhythm for a life when we allow it to. It really does shape our souls. And I've heard people talk about it gets down into your bones. And
yes.
people reach for those words in those times of distress. I mean, I think that's one of the beauties of the liturgical tradition, is that when we do hit those difficult times, like you were talking about, we have that thing that we can reach for, that language that we reach for, that can support us and help carry us through, as well as the community.
Yeah.
I mean, even I feel like even Jesus did this. He was on the cross, and what does he reach for? He reaches for a psalm, and he says that from the cross. And so the idea that all that stuff gets in our bones, it's not just something we're supposed to tick off. There's a reason that we there's a reason that we say this promise.
Right. And it's also, I've noticed through the years too, because every parish has its diversity, and sometimes that diversity can get edgy and difficult between individuals and groups. But those folks that have sat in the pews together and exchanged the peace together and said the prayers together and walked up to that altar together, there's something deeper that unites them than all their differences. And when the rubber hits the road in parish life, and folks need to come together, that bond, that common life is there. And it's so strengthening, because then you can do far more than the sum of your parts. Because as I say, I mean, baptism is so much about us, kind of, that we're bearing God's energy and God's spirit into situations and into the world. And this is our way to ground ourselves in that energy and in that spirit. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I mean, you think about it in our current moment. It's no surprise we're in a politically divisive moment right now. But it is that baptismal covenant. It is that shared life that transcends those maybe political differences or economic differences or racial differences or differences in sexuality that we see within many of our parishes. That kind of common core identity that binds us together and transcends nationality too. I'm curious, as you've worked in a variety of different kinds of parishes, how has your interaction with this particular baptismal covenant promise been reflected in your current work in Church of the Advocate? Have you noticed how worship affects an intentional community like Church of the Advocate, and what it does for members of the Church of the Advocate as they kind of gather together.
Um, I think one way I've certainly noticed it, as you have, as any of us have, is when we first were not able to meet every week, something that we had just sweetly taken for granted.
Right.
It just became so starkly evident how much that worship, that act of worship that, 40 to 60 of us engaged in, how much that affected what happened afterwards in terms of how we welcomed and how we fed and how we had fellowship with the strangers and the neighbors off the street that would come in, because a certain a certain tone and we'd all kind of, it's like an orchestra, we'd all kind of done the tuning, and when
Right.
it was time to play, we were all in tune and all able to work together in good ways. And another thing that I've noticed, David, during this COVID time, I've had some time to talk to former vicars and former deacons of Church of the Advocate. And one thing that has been a common thread throughout all of them, I know I'm being subjective, but I think this is a theme that has run through. And that is from the very beginning, before the Undercroft, before it was even really located at Trinity, but when the first Episcopal priest took to the streets and began to meet with people, and then was asked to be the celebrant at a Christmas Eve service that was held at the Presbyterian Church across the street. A bishop came, a Bishop Sims came and took part in and observed this Christmas Eve service for the homeless. And at that service, a woman, while she was receiving communion, said, "Would you baptize my baby?"
Oh.
Out of the, no appointment, no,
I'm not sure this is the proper day.
And they did. They baptized that baby, and Bishop Sims said, like it was an epiphany, this is a church. I mean, it's not just a gathering for homeless people. This is a body, a church, and it's a sacramental center for certain people. And that has held true for Advocate all the way through, because the different programs have come and gone and strengthened and swelled up and shrunk and whatnot. But it seems like that weekly worship of a motley crew has been the center that held everything else together. And what I hear from folks that go to other, and I mean, there are lots of people that feed a lot more and do a lot more in quantity than we do. But what some of the homeless folks have said to me was, there's a peace here that I don't find anywhere else of the agencies where they go. And I think it's because of this sacramental presence, because of our worship.
It's a place where they belong, and they're reminded that they belong.
Yeah.
It's not just kind of a shelter or a place for away from the cold, or a place for a hot meal. It's a place where they can be themselves and loved as themselves and welcome to the table. I think that's a beautiful part of the core, and what really anchors that the ministry of Church of the Advocate that's so beautiful there. So, as we think about baptism and we've had these experiences in baptisms, what for you as a priest, we've taken ordination vows, but as you mentioned, our baptismal vows are the first vows that we take, and it's the vows that everybody take. What is it about the baptismal vows as we find them in the BCP that are particularly meaningful to you? So not necessarily just about this particular question that we're talking, but all of them as we go through this service, it's something that we remind ourselves of at multiple times throughout the year. What is it about the vows in general that touch something in you?
I think two epiphanies I've had over the years. So one has to do about the vantage point of baptism, and the other has to do with the communal aspect of it. So um, I love this quote, and I don't know who to attribute it to, but it goes something like this. That at baptism, we don't ask what happens to the infant if the infant dies before baptism. Remember, that was the old, we've got to get them to heaven and save them from hell and all that. So it's not what happened to the infant if it dies before baptism, but the question is what happens to the infant after baptism. And so that it's a future oriented thing rather than a past, or we don't do it for what has gone before so much as we do it to put us in that, well, to die. I mean, to die with Jesus and his death, to the status quo of the world and how people just live on earth, and make that radical shift into living that kingdom-centered, future-centered life that's always looking forward and being fed and fellowshipped and studied and all the things in this one question, that all of that happens so that we are ready and able to bear that energy and spirit of God into the world with great expectancy, because the world's been redeemed. I mean, I think that the resurrection was a kairos moment that affects all time. I used to teach high school kids at an Episcopal high school, and we that Avatar movie,
Right.
but we would watch that movie and talk about living as a human being on the earth as it is, and in the status quo powers that are, and then what is it like to step into that paradise, that kingdom that has already been established for us, and to then, when they turned into the avatars, they bore this energy and this capacity that they didn't have as mere humans. So we kind of played with that as a way of thinking about it. So being future oriented is that was a big change for me as I lived further into it, because there's such hope in that. I mean, we are becoming more and more, we're stepping into living that risen life with Jesus. So it's a wonderful path to be on.
It's not necessarily like I was baptized. It's that I am baptized and I continue to be baptized. It's that orientation and direction that we're traveling. I'm traveling into my baptism, so to speak.
Absolutely, this path, the very intentional path that's so life-changing. The second one is that question. This is what hit me with this elder study group, was that question, will you do everything in your power to support this person in their life in Christ? And we heard that question being asked of us as the church, as we looked at situations as people age. And it was kind of a group epiphany moment when it's like, what are we doing to help these faithful people that have made these vows, like you said, to continue to grow in their baptism? So not only lifelong learning, but are we helping them? Are we assisting them to receive communion and to continue to grow in Scripture? Are we doing everything in our power to make sure that they enjoy that awesome fellowship that we take for granted?
That's a really profound
thought. A lot of work.
Yeah, a really profound thought, because when we ask that question, we tend to think of it as like small children are being baptized. How are we going to support this person? And in our heads, I think we automatically say through confirmation. As if that promise we make in that to support these persons ends there. But to think about how we as a community support all of our baptismal vows throughout all the different ages of life. That's a fantastic insight.
And then it gets to nuts and bolts. How's this fellowship going to happen? Or do you get them to church, or do you take communion? But all of that, and then paired with that, doing everything in our power, that wonderful, I'm looking for it here, the prayer after the baptism, give them an inquiring, discerning heart, the courage to will and to persevere, spirit to know and love you, and the gift of joy and wonder in all your works. Our elders deserve to be in a context that continues to invite that of them, or to draw that from them. So so it really hit us, the promises that we make every time there's a baptism. And it comes right back to that first question of them being able to practice those practices faithfully that they've promised to practice, promised to engage in.
As we've been talking, one of the things we've kind of touched around the edges of it a little bit. One of the things that keeps coming up in my head is that how difficult this particular piece of the baptismal covenant has been in the midst of a pandemic, when we haven't been meeting in person as much, and the times that we have been meeting, they're outside and they're limited. This is a really hard one to kind of experience in the way that we are accustomed to experiencing it right now. And maybe that is part of what so many of us feel is missing or off in this time, because we miss being together, but it's more than just being around each other. There's something deeper that we miss. And we worship together online and all that, but being in that space together where you've been formed, where you've experienced the intimate love of God meeting you in your times of great happiness and sorrow, being in that place where you've been formed for years and years and years, and then not being able to, that's a loss. That's hard. And so I think we've had to almost grieve part of that, reimagine part of that, maybe even fast part of that. It's been a hard piece of the pandemic. And you're right, it's so core to how we move through our baptismal vows.
And the church, the architecture of the church of Trinity, or any other church that somebody identifies with deeply, that people are so used to that place setting the tone for all of this, and those places then become sacred space and holy ground.
They're thin places, they're those thin places.
Yes. Yeah. And so it's a real challenge. I talked to an old friend who had not even gone onto the parking lot of her church since March. And they finally opened up, and so many, a few people could come in, kind of like Trinity's doing. And she said, my gosh, Dena, she said, when I stepped in onto that aisle into the nave of that church, she said, I felt my feet just like root below the floor. She said, I never knew what a powerful space that is to me, because she was in and out of the church every week, So we're just beginning to understand some of the effects of this. And I mean, I hope we don't have to adapt too much, but I do know that this time is inviting us to
completely
some of this out. Yeah.
No, in those moments where we've been able to have some limited communion, being able to be a part of people's first communion experience for months has been a really powerful thing as a priest. That's really reminded me of the sacredness of what God does in the midst of our communal worship. I mean, I certainly don't do it, but what God does in the midst of all that is amazing. So speaking of things that God does, baptism is one of those things that we participate in, but God kind of does.
That's right.
Baptism it's central to all Christians. All Christians participate in baptism in some way. But it means different things to different people in different denominations. So for you as a priest, for you as a Christian, you as an Episcopalian, what does baptism really all about? Like if we were to draw the lens completely back, so we focused on one question, we've slowly kind of moved back. What is this whole baptism thing all about? In a nutshell.
In a nutshell, I just think it's so much like other liturgical rites in that the words have been so worn and massaged and they've taken on so many different meanings from so many different points of view and so many different levels of spiritual development that it's amazing to me that these relatively few words can mean so many different things to so many different people, yet we all say them, together. So I think it's interesting for any Christian to look back and, I mean, I was baptized as a Southern Baptist when I was 12 years old, like all other Southern Baptist kids. And
it's a rite of passage. It's a rite of passage. I was in the Churches of Christ, and we did the adult baptism. And I say adult loosely because I think I was like 10 or 11. So
but yeah, and I remember Jesus tenderly calling me forward, and me saying to the pastor, yes, I give my life to Jesus as my Lord and Savior. And I remember thinking, oh my God, I'm clean right this minute, and I can't ever do anything wrong again. I mean, it scared the living daylights out of me. But I felt like it was all up to me. I think what we've talked about in the Book of Common Prayer rite, the Episcopal rite, is that it's with the help of God and with the support of my community, and we're never, ever, ever alone in this walk. And the moments that we fail, somebody else is victorious or whatever. But we're part of a larger body, and that has become more real to me as I've aged.
I love that our baptismal covenant kind of assumes that we're going to fall.
Yes.
I mean, I think that's actually the next question. Or so
it doesn't say if you fall; it says when you
fall into sin, will you repent? So there's
right.
That we're going to mess up, and that genuinely that is a comfort. It is a comfort because these are hard questions. Even this fundamental question that we're talking about being faithful to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship. I mean, even still, that's a difficult thing for many of us, and so the idea that we can even fail at that and still be okay is great. And it's a comfort and a tenderness to it.
Yes, and there's another metaphor might be a flowing river. Rivers are so much a part of the whole image of baptism, but looking back is trying to swim upstream, and God doesn't want us to do that or struggle that way. He really wants us to be in the current and in the current of the communion of saints and moving into that future that we talked about. So
that is a beautiful image. I would actually love to leave it there because that's just such
okay.
of swimming in that or going with the current of that communion of saints and that river of life that flows from the throne of God, as that old Southern Baptist hymn goes.
Let's sing it. Yeah.
That it's just such a wonderful image of being surrounded and carried and being an active part of it all at the same time. What a beautiful, comforting, and generous image to leave it with. It's wonderful. Thank you, Dena, for being with us today.
All right. It was good to spend time with you.
Thanks, y'all. Tune in next week. We'll be back next week talking about another piece of the Baptismal Covenant. Thanks, y'all.